Now I've done a video similar to this before, but due to the age of that video and the new release of GenerateBlocks 2.0, I thought it was time to tackle this topic again. So in today's video, we're going to be tackling how to set up a blog page using GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks. So like I typically do when I want to start a new design, I went through and got a bunch of inspiration. So you can see I just copied and pasted some layouts here inside of Figma so I could just gather some ideas of what I liked and what I didn't like. You'll notice here in a second that I took heavy inspiration from the colors on this website into my design. So what I ended up coming up with was this blog design here. We of course have our header up at the top, a hero section, and then our list of all of our blog cards. Now this design isn't anything too fancy. It's a pretty standard grid with a card design that brings in the featured image, the title, the author, and the categories. So what we're going to be doing today is setting up this loop here and connecting all the dynamic data to make a functioning blog page using GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks 2.0. Now, the important thing to understand is even though I did have to go in here and create a blog page here, you can see it's completely blank. But if we went and viewed it on the front end, you can see it's actually bringing in all of our blog posts here. And that's because WordPress treats this blog page as an archive template. Now you do have to create one setting in order to do that. That's here on the back end under settings and reading. We've set our post page to our blog page. So even though that page is blank on the back end when we go and edit it, WordPress knows that's where we want to display our blog. So it's bringing in all of those posts dynamically. Of course, when we go look at it, it's pretty ugly. This is just bringing in all the defaults here, and this is where we need to go style it. Now, the only thing I'm not going to go through in this video is setting up this header and this hero section. This hero section, like I said, you don't see it inside the blog page itself. It's actually being brought in through an element called a page hero. And so here we have my blog hero set up, which is just bringing in this section at the top of the page and inserting it dynamically into our blog post. I know my buddy Adam Wright has done some videos on how to set up page heroes, so I'll make sure to link that down in the description below so you can see how to set one of those up for yourself. Now to create this blog loop inside of here, we don't actually want to go and edit this page. What we want to do is create an element. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this elements here, and we're going to go ahead and create a new element. Now what we need from our drop-down list here is a block element, and we can go ahead and hit create. I'll just give this a title of blog loop. And then over on the right-hand side, we need to set this element type to a loop template. This is just going to tell WordPress that this is the element we're going to be using to replace into our blog feed. We actually also need to tell it where we want it to be located. In this case, we want it to be in our blog. And just to test things out, I'll just type my name in here into the text and we'll go ahead and publish this. And now if we go back to the front end of the site into our blog page, we can see instead of having all those default posts, that's been replaced by what we've created here inside of our loop template where I just put in the text that says Kyle. So now that we know it's working, we can actually go back in here and start setting up our blog loop. I'm going to start by just adding a container to the page and making sure I change this tag name to a section since this is a section on this page. Inside of that, I want an inner container that's just going to constrain everything to the content width of my website. Now, there's no padding in here yet, but I have some default classes set up in my starter site. This one is called Section D, and it just gives a certain amount of top padding as well as left and right padding. So now that we have our section set up, we need to add our query loop inside of it. So using the block inserter here, I'm going to search for query, which is going to bring up this query block by GenerateBlocks. You want to make sure you select this one here, which is just labeled query and has a blue icon, not the default WordPress query loop block. We'll go ahead and select our query block here, and we can see it gives us this option to start with some defaults, but we're just going to start things completely blank. Now, it doesn't look like it's added much to the page, but if we go in here and open our list view, we can see we have our container. Let's go ahead and name this. This is going to be our section. Inside of that is the inner wrapper we set up, so we'll just call this inner container. And then inside of that is the query block we inserted. But that actually brings in several blocks inside of it. We have our query block, the looper block, and a loop item block. All of these are important to get our loops on this page. So let's start with this query block here. Essentially, all we're going to need to do with this is worry about this settings panel here where we set up the type of query we're going to be doing. Since we're querying blog posts, a post query is perfect, although we do have other options there as well. We're not going to worry about pagination in this video, but you can choose from standard or instant. But down here where it says post type, by default, it's going to go ahead and query in our post, which in this case is exactly what we want because we're querying in our blog post. But if you wanted to query in something else, right now we have pages. If you set up a custom post type, that would show down in this drop-down list as well. Lastly, here we have our post per pages. We're just going to go ahead and leave this at 10. Now we're doing that because if we go back into the back end of the site and go to post all posts, I've gone ahead and created 10 blog posts for this site. All of these have a title, a featured image, and a category. Only one of them has any real content in it. So when we go and develop out the single post template, we have something to work with, but the rest of these are all pretty much blank. But since we only have 10 posts to worry about, I'm going to leave this at 10 posts per page. We could always adjust this if we need to and add things like pagination. Now inside of this query block is our looper block. This is what's going to control the overall layout. So in our Figma design, we had 3 columns. So this is what we're going to want to use to set up that column structure. Here inside the settings panel, we actually have a few different options. If we went into the styles panel and under layout, we can see this is set to display of default. But if we go into our settings panel here and choose the 3 columns, since we're using a 3-column layout, if we go back into the settings, we can see it's changed it to display grid, and it's also set a grid template columns of repeat 3, min max 0, 1 FR, which is just a fancy way of saying give me 3 responsive columns. Now we can't really see these columns on our page right here because everything is blank, but because we have those posts on our site and we're querying in the posts, it's actually bringing in cards for each one of these posts. To show you that, I'm just going to go ahead and click on our loop item. We'll go into our borders and add a 1 pixel border. And now you can see all 10 of our posts are being queried in here. We're just not seeing anything because we haven't brought in any of that information dynamically yet. However, adding this border has showed me that I forgot to add some gap in between our columns here. So I'll just go back to our looper, and here under column gap, I'm going to give it 24 pixels of column and 24 pixels of row gap. Now lastly, we have our loop item, which is our individual cards in this case. I'll go ahead and get rid of that border because we don't need it. Now we can go ahead and select any one of these cards, but really we're only styling one loop item, and then it's just getting repeated over and over again. So all we have to worry about is styling one, and all the rest of them will inherit those same styles. I think that'll make more sense once you see it in action. Now, before we start adding all the elements like our image and text into this blog card, let's review what this design looked like. We can see here we have a card that has a white background and rounded corners. We have a featured image. We have text here for our title. And then we have 3 bits of text here in a single line. We have the author name, a bit of a divider, and then our categories here. So this gives us an idea of all the elements we're going to need to add to this card. So inside of our loop item here, the first thing I'm going to add is our image because we're going to need to bring in that featured image. I like to start by just getting all the elements we're going to need on the page, and then we can go back through and style it. Underneath that, we have all the text. All of that needs to go in a wrapper here. So I'm going to go ahead and add a container to the page because we're going to have to add some padding into that. Now inside of that is our title. So I'll go ahead and add a headline block. H2 is fine in this case. Underneath that, we have those 3 bits of text, the author name, the slash, and then the categories. So in order to get all those in a single line, I'm going to need a container here. So we'll go ahead and add that container, and inside of it, we'll add 3 text elements. So I'll go ahead and add 1, and then I'll use Shift, Command, and D on my keyboard to duplicate that 2 more times. Now this gives us all the elements we need on the page. In fact, let's go ahead and name these as well. This container here, we'll go ahead and rename that. This is going to be our text wrapper. And then down here, this container, we'll rename this. This is going to be our meta wrapper, since this is kind of the meta information for the post. So let's go ahead and bring in all this dynamic data. So instead of just seeing the placeholder for the image here, we actually see the image for each one of these posts. So I'll go ahead and click on our image here, and over on the side panel under the settings, we can click this little dynamic tags database icon, and this will bring up the dynamic tags window. From this drop-down list, what we want to bring in here is our featured image, which is an option right here. So we'll go ahead and click featured image and then insert our dynamic tag. Once we do that, we can see the query actually working. It's bringing in a different featured image for each one of these posts because each one of the posts has a different featured image. Now we need to do that for all the rest of the items inside of our loop as well. So we'll go here to our heading block, which is going to be the title of our post. Here we can click that same icon for our dynamic tags. And for this, under the drop down, we're going to select post title and click insert dynamic tag. You can see now it's bringing in all the titles of all of our blog posts, which is perfect. Next, we're going to need the author name here. So we're going to click this dynamic icon and we're going to bring in some author information. Here, we're going to go ahead and select author meta. We're going to use the source as the current post. And here we need the actual key for the author's name. Now, because we're in an element here and not a page or a post, it doesn't give us the dropdown with the list of all the keys we can choose from, which would be really helpful. Unfortunately, we have to know what we're looking for here. Now, I know that we're going to want to bring in the name of the author, and the meta key for that is display_name. So we'll just go ahead and type that in and click add. That inserts it into this dynamic tag down here. And when we insert that dynamic tag, you'll see it's been updated to show my name across all these posts because I'm set as the author of these posts. Now, underneath that, we have our little divider, the slash that we're going to use. I don't really want that to be a paragraph tag, so I'm just going to change that to a div, and I'm just going to type in a slash here because that's all we need for that little symbol. Underneath that, we have our last bit of text. Again, we're going to use this dynamic connection here, and we're going to go down here to terms list, which is going to allow us to bring in the category. So here under select taxonomy, we're going to choose categories. And then because some of these posts have multiple categories, we're going to add a separator here. So to separate out multiple categories, I'm going to want a comma and then a space. So I want to make sure to type in that space so the words don't butt up right next to each other. And then we can go ahead and click Insert Dynamic Tag. You'll see here it's bringing in these individual categories, but on some of these posts like this one here, it has gear reviews and hiking. It's gone ahead and added that separator dynamically with the comma and the space in between it, which is exactly what we wanted. So now that we got all of our dynamic data brought in, all we need to do is start styling this to make it look like our Figma document. I'll just start at the very top and we'll work our way down. Now here for this loop item, you could go ahead and give this a class, which I would recommend. Although in these cases where you're using a loop, you don't necessarily have to give it a class because it's going to loop through the same design on each one of these cards. However, it's just safer to go ahead and give things a class. That way, if you want to reuse these styles somewhere else in a different template, you can take advantage of the hard work you've already done. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a class of blog-card and we'll hit create. We'll start with a blank style, and we know that we want to give this a white background, so I'm going to go into our backgrounds here and select white for our background. We also had rounded corners on this card, so I'll go into our borders here. I'm going to link all sides of our border radius, and I'm going to give this 12 pixels of border radius. Now you can see down here at the bottom, it did give us our border radius, but here at the top, the image is actually overflowing that border radius, and we want to prevent that from happening. So to do that, I'm going to go back into position here and scroll down to where we have our overflow settings. And I'm going to change the overflow X and the overflow Y to clip. That will just make sure to clip out this image so that it respects those border radius we've put on this card. I think that's all we need to do to this blog card itself. So we'll move down to our image now. For our image, let's go ahead and give it a class of blog card _image and we'll hit create. Now in this case, we get a few more settings to choose from here, including the copy local block styles or move local block styles. And whenever you see this happen, it's because GenerateBlocks has put some styles on this element by default. Now we could leave them there, but it makes it a little bit harder to override. So I'm going to actually select move the local block styles, and that will move any of those default styles over to my class where I can then edit them. So we'll go ahead and go to start editing, and I'm going to go in here into the sizing. The problem I have with these images right now is they're not all the same proportions. So you can see this bike image is quite a bit shorter than this waterfall image next to it, and I want to make sure they're all the same exact height. So to do that, I'm going to change this width here to 100%. I just typed in the % key on my keyboard, and that will automatically change this unit here to %. Now, instead of giving it a fixed height, I'm going to go in here into aspect ratio, and I'm going to type in 16/9, which is going to give this an aspect ratio of 16/9. This will just make sure that all of our blog images are the same exact proportions so they line up really nicely. Next in our list is our text wrapper. So again, I'm going to give this a class. We'll call it blog card _text-wrapper just to keep our naming convention here in place. And we don't have the move styles, so we know that this is a completely blank element. So we'll just go ahead and start with the blank style and hit start editing. Now what we need to do to this is give it some padding. So I'm going to go in here to our spacing. We'll link all these values together and we'll give it 24 pixels of padding. This will just make sure that the text in our card isn't butted up against the edge like our image is. The next thing on our list here is our post title, which in my eyes is much too big. In fact, if you go back to our Figma document, not only are those quite a bit smaller, they're actually using the sans serif font in this design. We can see this big headline up here is using our serif headline, but here in our blog cards, we actually want our sans serif headline, which is Rubik. So let's go back into the editor here and go ahead and give this a class. Again, we'll do blog card, _, and we'll call this title. Go ahead and hit create, and we can start with a blank class. We'll go in here into our typography, and under font family, I can select Rubik from the dropdown, which is one of the fonts I already installed on this site. So once I do that, we can see it's changed from that serif font over to our sans serif font. The only other thing I need to change here is our font weight. By default, it's set to 400, but I actually want this to be a little bit bolder, so I'm going to select my 500 weight. Now the size obviously is too big here, but I want to keep things consistent with the rest of my website and making sure I'm using the same type scale. Here on the admin bar's website, I actually have a responsive font size calculator. I did a video on this, so I'll link to it so you can check that out and see exactly how it works. But I use this font calculator on this site already to give me all my different heading sizes. Now, part of that calculator is the fact that it gives us some utility classes where we can change any element to be the size of a different element. For example, if we want our H2 to look more like an H5, all we have to do is give it the class of fs-h5, and it's going to resize that H2 to this font size here, which is done in a clamp value. So we're going to take advantage of that here in our design to make sure that we're using the same type scale for things, even though we want this H2 to be smaller. I don't just want to use an H5 heading here because semantically the headlines would be out of order, so it's important that we keep this in H2 since the only other title on this page is our big H1. So we'll leave this as an H2, and I'm going to go back out of our global styles here and go into our settings panel under advanced. Inside this additional classes, I'm going to type in fs-h5. Now what this did is just apply the H5 font size to this heading here, which looks a lot closer to what we had inside of Figma. Next up on the list is our meta wrapper, which is wrapping the author name, the slash, and the category. Remember, we want these all to be in a line. So to do this, we need to set it to a display of flex. Again, I'm going to go ahead and give this a class. We'll call it blog card, _, meta-wrapper. We'll go ahead and hit create. And we don't have any styles on this, so we can start blank. Now here under layout, I'm going to change this from default to flex, which will put all of these in line with one another. Now we do need a little bit of gap in between them, so here under the column gap, I'm going to change this to 8 pixels, which will just space these out nicely from one another. Now as far as the meta information on here, I really don't need to do any changes to the author name or the category. However, I do need to change this divider here, which was quite a bit thicker in our design and also lime green. So I'm going to give this a class of blog-card _divider, and we'll go ahead and hit create. Under typography, I'm going to change this font weight to 700, and I'm going to change the text color to our lime green from our palette, which will just make it better match what we had inside of our design. Now you can see the spacing is kind of weird here. We have the nice 24 pixels here, but here we have a lot more spacing. And that's because all of our paragraphs here get some default bottom margin. So what I'm going to do is click on this first one here, hold shift on my keyboard and click the last one. This will just make sure I'm selecting each one of these text blocks. Then I'll go here under styles, under spacing, and make sure the bottom margin is set to 0, which should bring that up and make that spacing a little bit more consistent around my card. Now you're probably noticing the same mistake I see here. And we can see the meta information is at the bottom of the card here. This headline has 3 lines and the spacing looks great. But the card next to it only has 2 lines in the title, and since it has the same spacing between the title and the meta information, that's leaving a big gap at the bottom of our card. I think I'd prefer it if this meta wrapper was always pushed to the bottom, and if there was extra space, it was just between the title and the meta information. So to do that, we're going to go back to our loop item here into our blog card class that we already set up. And we're going to go into layout and change this display to flex. Now that's going to screw things up for a minute, but if we go into our flex layout here and select column, that will put everything back in order. Now, it didn't quite fix our problem, but it was an important step in getting to the solution. Next, we're going to go to our text wrapper here. We'll make sure we select that class we set up, and we're going to do the same thing, changing this display to flex and the flex direction to column. At this point, we can go ahead and get this working by going to our sizing and setting the height to 100%. This will just make sure all the cards stay the exact same height. And then we can go into our layout under alignment, and we can change this justify content to space between. What this is going to do is just push this meta wrapper all the way down to the bottom, and it's going to give us that look we were after, where if there's extra space, it goes between the title and the meta information here, which I think gives us a much cleaner look since it keeps consistent padding around this entire card. At this point, I think we got everything looking just about the way we want it to, but there's no way for somebody to go on this page and click through into any of these blog posts because we haven't set up any kind of link. What I want to link in this is the blog post title here, so I'll just make sure that I have that title selected. Now, we're going to want to go back into our dynamic options here and click on our post title. Here we have the option to link to, and I want to link this to the post. We'll go ahead and update that dynamic tag, and we can see now it has an underline, and you can tell it's a link because my cursor changes once I hover over it. However, from a user experience point of view, I'd really prefer people to be able to click anywhere on the card, not necessarily click exactly on that link. We could have just made this entire loop item a link, but that actually poses some accessibility challenges, so I'd rather avoid that. I'd rather have this title as a link, so that's what gets read out to screen readers. To make the title the link but have the entire card clickable, I have a little bit of CSS here that I've set up called stretch link. I'll make sure to include this CSS down in the description below, but we're going to apply this stretch link class to our card, and that's essentially going to create a wrapper that allows the entire card to be clickable, even though the title is really the link inside the card. So back here in the editor, I'm going to make sure we have our loop item selected. I'm going to go into our settings panel again under advanced, and under this additional classes, I'm going to type in stretch-link. Now, once we add that class, this entire card now is clickable, even though it's really only the title that's linked, which is exactly the UX we were going after. However, I don't want this underline here, so again, I'm going to make sure to go into my blog card. We'll drop down this More menu, and we'll make sure we select our links. What this is doing is selecting any links inside of our blog card, and we'll go down to our typography, and we'll just make sure the text decoration is set to none, which will get rid of that underline. And now that we got everything set up, we can go ahead and save all of our work here. And when we go to the front end of the website, we can see all of our cards showing up here that links to all of our blog posts. If I click into one of these, it of course takes us to that individual post. And if I click into a different one, it takes us to that post. However, if I go in here into the inspector and start shrinking this width down, we can see we run into some problems. As we get into our tablet and mobile sizes, this 3-column layout just isn't going to work. So let's go back in here into the editor. We'll make sure we're selected on our looper, which is where that grid is set up. And we'll go in here into our tablet and mobile views. So for tablet, we want to change this layout. Instead of 3 columns, we'd like to do 2 columns. So I'll go back in here into the settings panel and change this to 2 columns, which looks pretty good. We'll go here to our mobile version, and 2 columns is obviously too skinny. So back into our settings, and we'll change this to 1 column. Now, if we save those changes and refresh on the front end, we can see here on desktop, we have 3 columns, but as we get to our tablet version, it snaps to 2 columns. And as we get to mobile, it snaps to just a single column. Now, the eagle-eyed among you might have noticed that what I just designed here doesn't look exactly like the thumbnail or the little screenshot I showed you at the beginning of this video. I wanted to set everything up in the most simplistic way possible just to get everybody started, but I do have a few design details that we can add to this to take this design to the next level. What I actually came up for this design was very similar, except I thought that repeated grid pattern got a little bit monotonous. So all I did to break that up was take this second post here in my grid and make it span 2 columns. And then this post down here, which is the 6th post in my grid, I made it span 2 columns as well. Since we're going to have 10 posts on our blog page, this evens things up and it gives us a little bit more visual interest. This isn't too difficult to do inside GenerateBlocks, so let's jump in and take a look at how we could accomplish this. I think the hardest thing about doing this technique inside the editor is we don't get a full preview of actually how it's going to look on the front end here on the back end due to some of the quirks with the way the DOM is set up inside the editor. So we're going to have to be kind of thinking about this and visualizing it in our mind and then going and checking our work on the front end. So if we remember that Figma drawing, we want our second card here and our sixth card here to span 2 rows. So what we're going to do is go into our loop item here. We'll make sure that we're in our blog card, and now we can start setting things up to make these specific cards span multiple columns. Now we do only want to do this on our desktop devices, as it's not going to work out very well on tablet and mobile when we no longer have 3 columns. So to do that, I'm going to click on this button here and make sure we've selected desktop. What this is going to do is set up a media query that's going to make sure anything we do at this point forward is only going to affect our desktop sizes. Now, because we're only wanting to select specific elements in here, we're going to have to create a unique selector here. So I'm going to click on the More dropdown and click on New. Now we are going to use a compound selector in this case, and this one's a little bit complicated, but I'll try to walk you through it. What we're going to type is a :is and then open and close our parentheses. What we need to do is select our second card and our sixth card. So to do that, I'm going to type in a : nth of type with hyphens in between it. And again, I'm going to open and close parentheses here. Now I'll move my cursor back inside of those parentheses. And the first one I want to select is our second card. So I'm going to type in a 2. Now we also want to select our sixth card, so I'm going to move my cursor over to the right 1 space. I'm going to type in a comma and then a space. Again, we need to do nth of type, and this time inside the parentheses, we're going to select our sixth. So what the selector is doing is saying, select the blog cards, but only the second and sixth blog card. So we'll go ahead and hit create here, and under our grid layout, under grid column, we're going to type in the word span 2. Now, like I said, we're not going to get a great preview of this on the back end. In fact, it looks like this one's being targeted, but not these. So we're not seeing exactly what we expected. However, like I said, this is just a quirk of the editor. So in order to know what's really happening, we're going to go ahead and have to save this and go preview it on the front end. We'll go ahead and refresh things here, and we can see our second card is indeed spanning 2 columns, and our sixth card down here is doing the same. So the CSS we wrote is actually correct, even though it looks a little funky in the back end. Now the problem we have is because we set these images up to be a certain aspect ratio, as it gets wider, it's also getting taller. That makes it look kind of funky with this card next to it that has a much shorter image. So to fix that, I think I actually want to restrict the height of this image to only be a certain amount of pixels tall. So I'm going to go ahead and select this image over here, and we can see that this image is about 231 pixels tall. So let's go ahead and jump out of the inspector and back into our editor, and we'll go to our image, make sure we select that image class, and here all we need to do is set a max height of 231 pixels. And if we go ahead and hit save, and refresh on the front end. And now we can see on this card that's spanning 2 columns, the image is only the 231 pixels tall, which matches the images next to it, and I think it gives it a better look in this case. Now the other thing that was slightly different was these headlines that were inside the cards that span 2 columns. Those headlines were a little bit bigger. So let's go in here and go back to our blog loop item. We'll make sure we have our blog card selected, and we'll go in here and take a look at this class we set up to select that second and sixth child. I'm going to go ahead and click on it here just so I can highlight all of this here. This is everything from the end of my class, starting with that is statement. And I'm going to go ahead and copy that to my clipboard so I don't have to type it all out again. We'll go back out of here, make sure we're in our blog card, and again, make sure we're only on our desktop devices. Now here, I'm going to go ahead and create a new selector, and I'm going to paste in the thing we just copied to our clipboard and make sure that the compound selector is selected. Now at the end of the selector, we want to select the heading within the second and sixth cards. So to do that, I'm going to go to the end of our selector here, type in a space, type in a period, and then we're going to type in the class name we have for that title, which was blog-card _title. Now we'll go ahead and hit create. And making sure that we're still on this media query, I can change the size of this headline. So we'll go in here under typography. The text size before was somewhere around 1.5 rem. I'm going to change this to 2 rem, and we'll go ahead and save these changes just to make sure it's working on the front end. We'll refresh here on the front end, and we can see this heading for this second card here, as well as the 6th card here, is quite a bit bigger than our other titles over here. Now we probably want to use a clamp from our type scale instead of this rem value, but I just wanted to show you how you could select these specific titles within there. Now, if we set up our media query right, if I go into the inspect here, once we get down into our tablet breakpoint, this should go into 2 columns, and those cards that we made span double the width should snap down to just being a single column width, which they do. Again, once we get to our mobile version here, these are all just a single column, which is perfect. Now, I probably should have addressed this a little bit earlier in the video, but I wanted to make sure I touched on it. If we go here into our loop item, which is each one of these individual cards, you can see our tag name is set to a div. Semantically, this probably isn't the best option. However, when I went and did some digging to see if this should actually be an article tag or a list item, I got some conflicting results. The first one I looked at was Equalize Digital's website. They're somebody who I really respect when it comes to accessibility. And if I look at their blog feed, each one of these cards is just set up to be an article tag. However, if I go to the ADA's website, ada.gov, their blog posts are set up to be in an unordered list with each card being a list item. So you'll have to do some research to see which one's best for your use case, but let's go ahead and see how we could set that up. The easiest solution is setting up an article. If we're on our loop item here, all we do is go under this tag name, change this to article and save it, and everything will be taken care of from there on out. Now, for some reason, it did go ahead and fix some of the issues with things not rendering properly in the editor here, which is kind of cool, and I didn't even know it did that. However, if you want to set this up to be a list with list items, we'll need to go back into the looper here and change this tag name to a unordered list or UL. Now inside the loop item, we'll want to change this from an article, or if you are still on a div, you want to change this to a list item. Now, if we go ahead and save these changes here, we'll go back to the front end and refresh, and you can see we have some weird gaps happening here with some margin on the left side of these. If we go into our inspector here, we'll make sure we're grabbing this div here and the unordered list inside of it. You can see by default, we have some left margin on this unordered list. In fact, if we go in here to computed, we can see that this has a left margin of 51 pixels. So we'd have to go back in here to our looper, which was our UL, and we want to make sure that under the spacing, we set that left margin to 0. If we go ahead and save that now and refresh on the front end, you can see our spacing is fixed and everything is aligned better at this point. So if you do end up using lists for yours, you'll want to make sure that you set that margin on the UL to have 0 left margin. And we can even double check in here, but I think under our loop item, which is our LI, if we go down here into list, the list type is set to default. We want to set this to a list type of none, just to make sure we don't get a random bullet point in front of all of our posts. Now, my original idea for this video was to also set up the single post template so we could display each one of our individual blog posts, but this thing got pretty long as it is. So I think we're going to go ahead and cut it off for now and save that for a part 2. If you enjoyed today's video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, and if you want to make sure to catch the next one, hit subscribe, and we'll see you then.